You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host from New York City, Ankit Panda, a senior editor at the Diplomat. And today, I'm happy to be joined by Greg Poling, who is director of the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative at the Center for Strategic International Studies in Washington, D.C. Thanks for joining me, Greg.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. It's been overdue to have you on the podcast. A lot of our listeners probably know that we talk about AMTI's work quite often, both in the writing that we do at the Diplomat, especially Prashant, who's my normal co-host, and I. When we write about the South China Sea, we definitely turn to the work that you guys do. It's really been great to watch AMTI grow. Actually, before we get into today's discussion, do you want to just tell us a bit about the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative and what you guys tried to do?
Yeah, I don't mind tooting our horn a little bit. So the Asian Maritime Transparency Initiative was set up here at CSIS going on 3 years ago now, and the idea was to make a clearinghouse for data both on what's happening on the ground or on the waters, if you will, and what's being claimed in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, and really all of Asia's maritime disputes, though admittedly the South China Sea sucks most of our time. But, the idea was to explain a set of very complex issues that are often misunderstood by policymakers and experts in whatever ways we could think of. That includes the satellite imagery that I think has really made our name, along with, online mapping and our own podcasts and video and graphics. Anything that doesn't require a 6,000-word treatise that no policymaker is going to read.
Absolutely, and I think it's a testament to the work you guys do that you're cited so widely in so many news reports on the South China Sea. So yeah, definitely. I mean, your imagery I think is really definitely very well known. You kind of see it all over the place. It's syndicated and run all the time. But anyways, Greg, I'm really glad to have you on since Prashant and I, we talk about the South China Sea off and on this podcast. Last year, we used to talk about it quite a bit more in the lead up to the ruling. And we actually did a podcast just a few weeks ago reflecting on what the ruling meant a year on. And naturally, we weren't too optimistic. But we'd also been talking about how it's been deceptively quiet and calm in the South China Sea. And I think we were talking about that maybe early in June. And a few things in recent weeks and months have made it clear that that was in fact correct. First, we had this incident with Vietnam and the disputed oil blocks with the Chinese coming in there, and then now the issue that I really want to dig into with you today is what's going on near Thitu Island in the Philippines, which I wrote about briefly at the Diplomat, and you've been on top of this too with the imagery. So why don't I actually let you kind of walk us through the series of events as we know them publicly? I mean, probably the best place to start might be with what Philippine Congressman Gary Aliano first alleged, and then we can maybe revisit some of the other issues that might have come up. So do you want to tell us a bit about what those allegations were and what you were able to uncover in the open source?
Sure. So this broke in the Philippine press on, I think it was August 13th, where Congressman Alejandro released some photographs and maps that he had said came from unnamed sources within the armed forces of the Philippines. They had passed them on to him, showing the sudden presence of a bunch of Chinese fishing ships, along with at least a couple of PLA Navy and one or two Coast Guard ships, within 1 to 3 nautical miles of Pagasa, or Thitu Island, which is the main civilian base for the Philippines and the Spratlys. They've got a little over 100 civilians living there year-round. It's also within sight of the Chinese base at Subi, just over 12 miles. So Alejandro had alleged that these ships started trickling in, the fishing ships first, around the 11th. By the 13th, they had the full number. By the 15th, I believe it was on the 15th, they said that they had overflown a couple of the sandbars that are situated between Subi and Thitu with their helicopters from one of the PLA ships. And this all led Alejandro to make a claim that is still unconfirmable, that this indicated the Chinese were preparing to, he said invade, but build on one of these unoccupied sand cays.
Right, and it's important that they're unoccupied. Right. Yeah. So yeah. I mean, his claim was again backed up by Justice Carpio, who I think compared this to what had happened at Scarborough Shoal in 2012, and obviously a few analysts had talked about the significance of Sandy Cay in particular a few weeks, I guess a few months ago and last year. Actually, I think as early as October 2015, after the Lassen's freedom of navigation operation, people started talking about that. Do you want to tell us a bit about the legal importance, potentially, of some of these unoccupied sandbars for China?
Yeah, nobody knew that these sandbars were there until 2015, I guess, with the Lassen passage. I mean, that's not fair. People knew. It was not a matter of public record. In fact, Sandy Cay was not named Sandy Cay until 2015. It was just a Sandy Cay, one of many.
Mm-hmm.
Now all of a sudden you see it with capital S, capital C, because it's so important to the legal status of Subi. Subi is the second largest of the Chinese artificial islands out there, and like Mischief Reef, which is the biggest one, it was completely underwater at high tide before the Chinese started building.
And why does that matter? I'm just going to ask you to just clarify that for our listeners.
Yeah, so that matters because if a feature is below water at high tide, it doesn't create its own territorial sea, much less any other maritime entitlements. The only way you can claim a low tide elevation like Subi Reef, meaning that it does, some of it pops up at low tide, but it's completely submerged, the only way you can claim that is if it sits within the territorial sea of another island or reef. And that would be Sandy Cay. It is within 12 nautical miles of this, at the time, unnamed Sand Cay, which means that whoever is the rightful owner of that unoccupied cay, whether it's China, the Philippines, or Vietnam, is also, by extension, the rightful owner of Subi Reef. And further, that Subi Reef, as a low tide elevation, basically a fringing reef of that Sand Cay, it would bump out that cay's territorial sea. So instead of Sandy Cay getting about a 12 nautical mile territorial sea, it gets something closer to 20 miles because it gets bumped out again by Subi Reef, which I think is about 8 miles away.
Right, and last year's arbitral tribunal ruling acknowledged that Subi Reef was a low tide elevation. It acknowledged that Sandy Cay was not a low tide elevation. Acknowledged that it would be what we call, I guess, a rock. But you know what I thought was interesting, I went back to the ruling after all of these, after this incident, and I looked at the status of Sandy Cay. It was interesting that the Philippines lawyers actually were arguing that Sandy Cay never existed, which I thought was interesting. I mean, maybe just given this ambiguity, because the court didn't didn't have jurisdiction to address any issues of actual sovereignty. So what was the deal with that? Do you know what the Philippines' thinking was here about Sandy Cay before 2015?
Well, the argument from the Philippine side is understandable. If Sandy Cay was below water at high tide before, then Subi Reef is illegally occupied.
Right.
Not just that it doesn't have any territorial sea of its own, but that it is in fact a piece of the seabed that China has no right to occupy.
Right.
Because you have to remember that the court ruled that none of the rocks in the Spratly Islands generate an exclusive economic zone or continental shelf. And that means that the only claims out there are going to be within 12 miles of the rocks.
Right.
Thitu Island is just outside of 12 miles from Subi. So Subi is a piece of international seabed unless Sandy Cay is a rock.
And is Subi on the Philippines continental shelf?
No. Subi is, Subi is not on a continental shelf the Philippines currently claims. It is not within 200 miles of the Philippine mainland. Now, that's not to say that the Philippines couldn't put in an extended continental shelf claim at some point in the future, but they haven't done so.
Right. Okay, so let's go back to these events that we were discussing, the allegations from Congressman Galeano. So your imagery was able to substantiate most of what he said. Is that right?
Yeah, we can substantiate the facts in the water. As far as the implied motivations on China's part, we can't. So we had imagery from the 13th that confirmed at least 9 Chinese fishing ships were arranged between 1 and 5 miles of Thitu, along with what looked like 1 Coast Guard ship and 1 Navy ship. Now, there might have been more under cover of the clouds or just out of the frame, who knows. But certainly we were able to confirm most of what he said. We could also tell that at least 2 of those fishing ships had nets in the water, so they, for whatever reason they originally showed up, they were fishing while they were there.
Right. Right. Okay, so let's talk a bit about our favorite character in the Philippines, President Rodrigo Duterte, who had it took him a while to publicly address this after the allegations were circulating. Reports had been already written up in a variety of outlets, and then finally he responds, and he had sort of a strange, non-committal, non-concerned reaction to the whole affair. Sort of conceding the premise that this was an aggravating action, since he implied that he wouldn't be willing to risk the lives of the Philippine armed forces in a naval confrontation with China. And obviously, if our listeners have been listening to the podcast before, they know that Duterte's been he's been launched this overall realignment of the Philippines' foreign policy since the Aquino administration, getting a lot closer to China, having a few kind of rocky moments with the United States that appears to have maybe changed this year, but there's still a vein of anti-Americanism there. So what did you make of Duterte's reaction to this? I mean, he really didn't see this as a potential quote-unquote invasion, as some people said. It really, I mean, almost appeared as if he had been notified by the Chinese side that something was coming.
We've seen this from Duterte before, whether it was with the presence of Chinese survey ships on Benham Rise on the other side of the Philippines, or disputes over Scarborough Shoal. Duterte does not feel that the South China Sea is of critical importance to Philippine national interests in the same way that most Filipinos do. He's often dismissive of the importance here. He's called Scarborough Shoal a fish pond in the past. He's also very defeatist. So he constantly says, "What do you want me to do about it? If I complain at all, the Chinese said they'll go to war and we'll lose that war." And this is basically what he said here, right? I'm not going. Right. I think the exact quote was something like, "I'm not going to go to war over a bunch of sandbanks. We'll be slaughtered." All of that is par for the course for Rodrigo Duterte. I mean, it's also fair to say that the claims that this was an invasion were obviously overblown. There's no evidence the Chinese stepped foot on any of these sand cays. They didn't use any violence. All of these waters are claimed as territorial seas by both China and the Philippines. They are legally in dispute as far as everybody else is concerned. It was undoubtedly a provocative act, and we should be concerned about this kind of saber rattling, but it wasn't an invasion of Philippine territory as far as the international community is concerned. Mm-hmm. Now, Duterte did say one thing that I think needs to get a lot more attention, and that I sincerely hope he walks back. He said, when asked about the U.S. Mutual Defense Treaty, that even if the Chinese did attack Filipinos, he would never call in the Americans because, quote, "I've lost trust in the Americans."
Right.
Now, Duterte has always been skeptical of American treaty commitments to the Philippines. On the campaign trail and since being elected, he's repeatedly said the Americans aren't really going to fight for us. So that's fine. If that is Duterte's belief, okay, that should color his decision-making. But the idea that you would say publicly, on camera, that even if the Chinese were to attack us, we would still never invoke the Mutual Defense Treaty, that's a little crazy. That's signaling to Beijing that there is absolutely no chance that he would ever try to call on the Americans as a deterrent, which takes the only bit of leverage the Filipinos have off the table.
Right, and could lead to serious miscalculation if he actually ends up invoking the treaty anyways, and the Chinese decide to come in before that. So yeah, I mean, let's talk a bit about the relationship that Duterte has with the United States today. His comments to Tillerson got some attention when he called himself the United States' humble friend. I think a lot of people took that to mean that maybe he was letting bygones with Obama be bygones now, and under Trump things would be a lot better. But obviously, we have also seen reports that the Philippines is potentially, maybe for the umpteenth time, considering allowing United States forces to use direct military force in the Marawi siege. And yet we have these comments again over the South China Sea. I mean, where do you think things will really shake out with Duterte in the United States? I mean, a little more than a year on into his presidency.
I think we'll continue to tread water. Duterte is ideologically anti-American. That's not going to change. It doesn't matter how positive meetings are with U.S. cabinet officials. It doesn't matter who's in the White House.
Yeah.
We've seen this before. He had pretty positive meetings in Manila with then Secretary of State John Kerry, and as soon as Kerry boarded the plane, he started laughing to the press about how poorly he was treating the Americans. And again, we see good meetings with Tillerson, and then he's in the press a week later bashing the Americans, saying that they're untrustworthy.
Yeah.
So this is pretty normal. That said, he also knows that he is wildly out of sync with his own defense establishment, with the armed forces, and with public opinion. So time and time again, whether it's the South China Sea or Marawi, cancellation of EDCA, all of these things he says, and then he bumps up against kind of the invisible walls of what's acceptable politically in the Philippines, and he walks back.
Right.
I think
So
we're going to continue to see that.
yeah, so I'm glad you brought up public opinion. That was one of the things that last year, again, we discussed shortly after Duterte's inauguration in the context of the South China Sea. It's this question that, Filipino national sentiment around the South China Sea clearly disagrees with Duterte about both the importance of the South China Sea as an issue to the Philippines' national interest and national dignity, but just more broadly about, this whole idea that China can be allowed to simply saber rattle at will, conduct all sorts of naval and coast guard operations in disputed waters with the Philippines. Do you think that this is starting to, a year on, do you think the public opinion issue is starting to become more of a problem for Duterte on the South China Sea, that if he kind of keeps up this defeatist attitude, it'll eventually come back to bite him?
I think that it is. It's very worrying if his popularity suffers in other ways. So, like any democratic society, it's pretty hard to make foreign policy a top issue for voters.
Right.
The day Duterte was elected, the people that elected him knew that they disagree with him on foreign policy. That it wasn't his positions on things like the South China Sea weren't a secret. They did it anyway because he was the law and order guy and the anti-corruption guy and the outsider. And all of that is still true, and all of that bolsters his popularity. But if for other reasons, whether it's an economic slowdown or negative backlash from the drug killings or his tax policy, if any of that undermines his popularity substantially, then issues like the South China Sea could be the noose that eventually hangs him. I mean, we saw something similar with Gloria Arroyo, where all of a sudden the allegation of crony capitalism with the Chinese and things like the Joint Marine Seismic Undertaking, they came back and were used as further ammunition for why she was unfit for office.
Right.
And I think you would see the same thing here. As long as Duterte is at 80 to 90% approval, people will disagree with him, but they're not going to throw him out of office over South China Sea. But if he loses his public stand and his congressional allies turn on him, this is exactly the kind of thing that can force him out of office.
Right, and we're almost 10 months on from Duterte's landmark visit to China, when he kind of came back with a range of agreements that were implemented to varying degrees. How do you assess, the state of the relationship between Manila and Beijing? Do you think do you think people have been making too much of this realignment that's been going on supposedly, or is there a degree of sincerity to this, that China is beginning to pluck the Philippines away from the United States orbit with a Duterte at the helm, even if Philippine public opinion continues to be overwhelmingly pro-American?
There's something to this. It's just not nearly as much as the press makes out.
Okay.
This is a tactical shift in Beijing. They've softened the diplomatic rhetoric. They are making promises of economic largesse, etc. Duterte believes it. It doesn't seem that the rest of the government does. The Philippine people are willing to give it a chance. But there is a big difference between promising economic largesse and actually delivering. We haven't seen any of the delivery yet.
Right.
And more importantly, there's a difference between speaking softly on the South China Sea and actually changing your strategic intentions. And things like what we just saw at Thitu, or as you said at the beginning of the podcast, the harassment of the Vietnamese efforts to drill for oil and gas, those show that China hasn't actually changed any of its strategic intentions. The goal is still complete control over the waters, seabed, and airspace of the Nine-Dash Line, and they'll do it by force or by mercantilists buying off if they have to. But either way, they have every intention of making it theirs.
Yeah, and I guess Greg, we'll close this podcast out, but before we do so, I wanted to get your thoughts on the draft the framework for the Code of Conduct in the South China Sea, which was recently adopted by ASEAN and China. I know you and I have talked about this a little bit on Twitter before, but do you want to tell the listeners what you think of this whole affair going on between ASEAN and China?
I think that this was a brilliant tactical move by the Chinese and a remarkable blunder on the part of ASEAN. They spent the last year negotiating an outline for a non-binding agreement they already agreed to 15 years ago, which seems an awfully big waste of time to me. The document, the actual framework, it was not publicly released, but it's been leaked everywhere. It doesn't specify anything about how you would actually calm the situation in the South China Sea. It just says some kind of vague niceties, sets out some principles of cooperation. It doesn't establish that it's going to be legally binding. It doesn't establish where it would even apply. And its only value is if it actually leads to an immediate start to real negotiations on a code of conduct. But as soon as it was released, we had Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, come out and say, we will maybe start negotiations if we decide the time is ripe, which is the same thing that China's been saying since they signed the Declaration of Conduct in 2002.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, hey, Greg, this was fun. Thanks for coming on the podcast to finally, I guess, geek out a little bit with me over the South China Sea, and I'll hope to have you back on soon.
Yeah, look forward to it.
Absolutely. Thanks, and take care. For our listeners, thanks for listening to the podcast, as always. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so. We'd love to have you on board for future shows. And if you are a subscriber but you haven't left us a review yet on iTunes, please do so. It really helps get the word out about the show. We'll be back next week with more on Asian geopolitics. Thanks a lot for listening.